I'm glad to see so many of you turning up, including some of our more distant folks. Sacramento and Australia are not really comparable distances, but they're both distant from Pasadena. So this is our annual get-together that we used to hold in various places where we could have food, but since we're doing it on Zoom, you'll have to provide your own. The whole idea of tonight's meeting is to share things that you've come up with over the year that wouldn't necessarily be worth a full talk, but are worth a couple of minutes of telling about because they're unusual or interesting in some way. And the whole idea is just to share some fun things because we can't be together sharing Christmas cookies and what have you, but we can have some unusual pieces of history. And that's really what this one's about. So, do we have somebody who is offering to be first with sharing something for this evening? Oh, we have a couple. John Sarna, unmute yourself and tell us what you got.
In some other meetings of this sort, I shared a story with several other individuals about a Masonic apron that kept one of my ancestors' homes from being destroyed by Union forces just before the Battle of Poison Springs in April of 1864 here in southwestern Arkansas. But I also have something that survived the American Civil War. It's actually a little bit of pre-Civil War, and this is it. This is it. It's a jar. I'm not exactly sure if it was made factory or if it was hand done. I want to say it was hand done. But this is a jar that was given to my great great grandparents by people who were passing through southwestern Arkansas in a wagon train heading west. And this would have been in the very late 1850s. Ironically, it was just outside the Poison Springs battlefield site where this wagon train had to stop for several days because of sickness. You had a minor epidemic of fever. I forget if it was scarlet fever or yellow fever or what it was that tore through that wagon train. Well, it turns out that a member of my family who basically had experienced a similar outbreak some years earlier was the only one to actually go down and volunteer to help the people in the wagon train to recover. And when they did, one of the families was from Pennsylvania, and they had a series, they had a couple of dozen of these jars, and these jars contained jam or preserves. The family has always referred to it as the jam jar. And
Sorry,
this is
that. Would you please repeat?
sorry. This is the only one that has survived to this day. And it was at, as best as I can figure, it was at the home that was saved by the intervention of that Masonic apron. But this has been in the family for over 150 years, and it survived the Civil War. It survived a number of ups and downs. Sorry, the lid disappeared. How long ago, I don't know. But this is one little item that I've got. Anyone who would like to find out about the Masonic apron story, let me know. I can post a photograph of it. And for those of you who might want to know the story, let me know and I can share that story with you. But my, if you will, contribution to the meeting for this evening.
So John, is that something that was just sitting on the shelf when you were growing up, or is that something that you actually used it for something? What was it? What was it to you when you were introduced to it?
Well, the first time when I saw it as a kid, ooh, nice toy, perhaps. I do remember my grandmother, my maternal grandmother, early on, on occasion, she used it as a flower vase.
Ah,
But she was the one who originally told me the story, and I talked with several other uh, members of the family, and they essentially confirmed everything, with the exception of what type of fever it was. And supposedly, family lore has a follow-up that when the wagon train was paused there, one of the male members of the family, I think male, must have fallen in love with one of the younger women who was a part of the train, abandoned his family, according to some versions, apparently his wife as well, and ran off with his, for lack of a better word, lover. Now, according to family lore, and I have not been able to verify this, he wound up at a little place called Mountain Meadows and was wiped out in the so-named Mountain Meadows Massacre of 1857. I never found out the name, never found out if it was in fact the case, but this was the one of several. I don't know, half a dozen or so, but this is the one concrete, if you will, pun not intended, bit of proof, of evidence of helping that the folks on the wagon train, the folks who were in need.
it has a mark on the bottom there. Were you able to identify who the maker
No,
was or anything?
no, I'm not sure. If anything, it looks kind of like an oddball number two, but I've not been able to find out. I did a Google search as to whether or not this would have been handmade or factory made, and got nothing conclusive. Nothing conclusive. I lean to the possibility that it was handmade.
That
Number
really
two,
quite possibly.
yeah.
And let me,
Uh, number two, I mean, that could be,
it looks like it, but whether or
yeah.
not it is actually,
I don't think it's large enough for to be able to be 2 gallons, but
no.
I mean, it may be
No,
2 pounds,
no, I think that's just
That's
a
about,
maker's mark.
it's about how much that would weigh,
right?
interestingly. So I
Yeah.
don't know.
I think that's a maker's mark that um, the potter who made that would have been their signature mark.
Very possibly, very possibly. But again, this was, like I said, this was pre-Civil War, but it did survive Union troops moving through southwest Arkansas in the spring of 1864.
Hmm.
Right.
That's great.
Thank you for sharing that.
And Janet, you had raised your hand. Do you want to be next?
This summer, I went to the Conference for Women in the Civil War, and this year it was held in Atlanta, Georgia. So after the conference was over, I was able to visit the Margaret Mitchell home, which has now been turned into a museum run by the Atlanta History Center. Uh, in July, they reopened with a newly revamped presentation on the life of the author and her first and only book, Gone with the Wind. So this is Margaret Mitchell and her husband. This was actually her second husband, John Marsh, lived in a small 2-room apartment in Atlanta from 1925 to 1932. And during that time in apartment 1, Mitchell wrote most of what became Gone with the Wind. She derisively dubbed their apartment the dump. And her apartment would have been on the lower left side of the building with the 3 balconies. The front side of the building actually fronts on another street and it terraces down. So you only, on the front side, you only see the second and third stories. Her upbringing, as she was a 4th-generation Atlantan, and both grandfathers fought for the Confederacy. Growing up, she often spent Sunday afternoons with older relatives and family friends who entertained her with stories of the war and its many hardships. Mitchell was instilled with Confederate sympathies from an early age. She later noted, perhaps only partly in jest, I had heard everything in the world except that the Confederates lost the war. When I was 10 years old, it was a violent shock to learn that General Lee had been defeated. This shows her living room and her writing desk. She entertained people in this apartment, and she would often put her manuscript into these envelopes and put it under the cushions of the seat so that no one would know what she was writing. A very small bathroom and her library. And I thought it odd that among the books that Mitchell could have used in writing her novels, such as The Klansman and Dixie After the War, that she would have a copy of General Sherman's memoirs, until I realized that if you want to write about the burning of Atlanta, that's pretty good source material. I thought the building includes crafted features such as the carved lion's head newel post to the upper story apartments, as well as an outdoor porch on the front side of the building on the second story. The exhibit talks about the impact of Gone with the Wind, and it talks about it, as I say, this is a revamped exhibit. It talks about both the good and the bad of Gone with the Wind and the right and the wrong of how it is interpreted. Mitchell completed her novel in 1935, and it was published in 1936. And in 6 months, it had sold 1 million copies at the unprecedented Depression-era price of $3. In 1937, Mitchell's book received the Pulitzer Prize for fiction, and the movie version was released in 1939. Over 30 million copies of the book have been printed worldwide, and it is the second favorite book of American readers, just behind the Bible. Mitchell and her family spent years asserting copyright in order to block international pirated copies of the book. And here she is pictured in 1947 with a lot of the international copies of the book. Even First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt got involved with the making of Gone with the Wind. She recommended that her maid, Elizabeth McDuffie, play the part of Mammy. And McDuffie was a graduate of Morris Brown College, was an early civil rights advocate, and President Roosevelt's unofficial liaison to the African American community. And you'll notice that as a closing point, Eleanor says, you know, she'd be so good at this because she was brought up where the scene is laid. I found that fairly amusing. On December 15th, 1939, the film premiered at Lowe's Grand Theater in Atlanta, and it was the culmination of 3 days' festivities in the city. An estimated 300,000 Atlanta residents and visitors lined the streets for 7 miles to view the procession of limos bringing the movie stars from the airport. A lot of the exhibit talks about the impact in popular culture of Gone with the Wind. This is part of the exhibit where it talks about Timeless Creations, a division of Mattel, who released a series of Scarlett O'Hara Barbie dolls in 1994 and a new series in 2014 for the 75th anniversary of the film's release. And who can forget Carol Burnett's famous send-up, Went with the Wind, which fostered another Barbie creation that looks obviously like Carol Burnett. Even Mad Magazine featured its own parody, Grown with the Wind, in this 1991 issue. The reevaluation of Gone with the Wind includes a lot of the statements that are listed here are from the Atlanta History Center's website about the Margaret Mitchell House Museum, and it shows a commitment to the reevaluation of the impact and of the book and the movie. They've used a panel of historians to provide context for the interpretations and separate fact from fiction. It provides this museum a new direction for understanding Margaret Mitchell and her time. So they're not just celebrating her as an Atlanta celebrity and writer of the great book. They're really taking a look at how Margaret Mitchell wrote this history, how she was a product of her time and her upbringing, and how that the portrayals in Gone with the Wind and the movie helped further that lost cause impact in understanding the Civil War. Margaret Mitchell was born in 1900 and she died in 1949 as a result of injuries of an auto accident. This operates as the Midtown unit of the Atlanta History Center. It is a designated Atlanta City landmark, and it is on the National Register of Historic Places. So I can highly recommend visiting if you're in Atlanta. This is a great museum to visit because it doesn't just whitewash how wonderful Gone with the Wind is. It tells the story of how it is both right and wrong in its interpretation, and I think it tells it very honestly. I'm appreciative of some of the historians who worked on that to be able to tell the story a little bit more honestly and to really get out the other side of it. It's I was very impressed with the interpretations.
Janet, did the museum have anything on the reasons why she never wrote anything else?
It didn't, but I think her premature death, she was only 49 when she passed away. I think that probably shut down the career. It wasn't that she didn't want to write anything more, but I think perhaps that she was so involved with the marketing of Gone with the Wind, the international copyright problems. I think that she was probably so engrossed in that that she didn't really get the chance to sit down and write something more. She was a journalist by trade, and she quit that job and she'd had an, an old injury, a childhood injury, and she was recovering from that. And her husband would bring home books from the library for her to read. And eventually he ran out of books and suggested, you may just want to write something yourself. And that began her quest to write about what she knew, which was the Confederacy and the stories that she'd been told. I think that was her primary uh, approach, was to get this book out, and it took up so much of her life afterwards that I don't think she was meant to be a prolific writer, even had she lived longer.
Could I break in and add a couple of things, please?
Sure.
Uh, Margaret Mitchell actually was supposed to have written a novel before she started on Gone with the Wind, but it was never published. It was found there. I'm not sure if it was ever published, but there was some scholarly responses to it, and apparently the quality of the writing, of course, is nothing like what was found in Gone with the Wind. Kind of anticipating the discovery of Harper Lee's original version of To Kill a Mockingbird some years later. What was it? Go Set a Watchman, I think, was the original version or the original idea of To Kill a Mockingbird. But if I also could, there are three video presentations. I don't know if any one of you would be familiar with it, but they're all worth a look. One is the excuse me, is a documentary that was made about 20 odd years ago, or not exactly which, but it's a feature-length documentary about the making of Gone with the Wind. And you have a good special edition, collector's edition of the movie on Blu-ray DVD. That's usually included. PBS several years ago, I forget if it was for American Experience or what is it, American Masters, did a program. They had, I think, a 1 hour documentary on the life of Margaret Mitchell, and that was pretty good.
Yeah.
That was pretty good. And let me see, back around 1980, and it was originally it was one part of a three-part miniseries. Each part was a feature-length film in and of itself, but it looked at Hollywood in the 20s, the 30s, and I believe the 40s. And the 30s was, I believe it was called the Scarlett O'Hara War. And it
Yes.
was a historically based look at the shenanigans, for lack of a better word, that was going on in Hollywood about the making of Gone with the Wind, particularly who was going to be Scarlett O'Hara. interesting bit of casting. Louis B. Mayer was, I believe, portrayed by Tony Curtis in that film. But those are three, in and of themselves, very interesting video presentations associated with Gone with the Wind that not everybody really knows about.
Mhm.
And Richard, I see you have your hand up.
Yeah, when this discussion's over, I was raising my hand again because
Oh.
when Janet was speaking, I realized I have something to add to it that has a display. So when
Okay. Yeah,
when the
absolutely.
discussion's over, I'll go next.
Okay, we'll come back to you in a moment, Richard. I'd like to be able to add my own comment in there for that. When Stephanie and I were dating, I actually am a collector of first edition books, and I have some first edition of 19th century and early 20th century books, including a first edition of Gone with the Wind. And I've had that in my collection since I was probably a teenager, early 20s. I bought it quite early. But um, Stephanie was visiting one day, and I had a small bookcase that just had my first editions on that, and she picked up Gone with the Wind off of the shelf, and she decided that she was going to read my first edition, which to me was very, very scary because that I had rarely even cracked the cover of the book, and to be able to have that there, and to be able to have somebody really just looking through my book, it was really kind of nervous for me to be able to do that. But on the other hand, that I liked her, and I wanted to make her happy, so I was allowing her to read my first edition book until the point when she set it down on the coffee table and then set her water glass on top of my first edition, and that was it. It's like, okay, I will get you another copy. You can read a new copy of that, but you're not going to go in and read my first edition if you're going to put a water glass on top of it. But fortunately, she didn't damage it. It was just a bit scary and just a bit nervous for me.
Imagine.
I don't know,
After all, what
Stephanie,
could go wrong?
if you want to be able to add to that, you're on mute there. She's on. She's here in the session. She doesn't have her camera on, but
Well, I did notice Emily's comment in the chat. Did you want to? Well, I guess everybody can see that, but that she had a connection to the Riverside showing of Gone with the Wind.
Oh, wow.
The story is told in that documentary that the manager of the theater delayed the actual showing of the sneak preview until his wife could get there, because he said he reminisced that if his wife missed it, she would just about file for divorce. She was that big of a fan of Gone with the Wind. And so that documentary also had a very interesting interview with a man who was a boy when the sneak preview was held. And it was supposed to be another sort of action film, a Western. I can't recall, but it was one that was released just about the same time. And the boy remembered being so disappointed when Gone with the Wind came up. And when the movie was over, he was, now, can we go see the Western?
I've seen the movie in different formats, and sometimes they've cut it to change the size ratio, and that doesn't work right.
We did have a question from someone about why it was published in one volume rather than in multiple parts. From my knowledge of printing and publishing, I can think of one reason. Because of when it came out, doing it in multiple volumes would have actually increased the price because the bindings were a significant part of the cost back in the 30s and 40s. Other than that, I don't know. There was one local publisher in Alhambra whose publishing company dated back to the 40s, and he would print his entire print run of a book, but only bind them in smaller quantities because of that cost issue. And so that was where I learned about the actual percentage of a book's printing run or printing cost that was the binding. But there might be some other reasons. She might have wanted it only in one volume, but I don't know.
And, and for export, certainly I know from books being printed in England sent to the United States, it was cheaper to import it unbound and then bind it in this country because of tariffs against bound volumes.
Oh,
Well, yeah, that's a whole different issue. The actual
Yeah.
storage and binding costs were higher for bound volumes here in California, at least. So it's a weird thing that you don't think of.
It might be some sort of tax business too.
Any number of things that would have had a higher value in inventory as two bound volumes, probably. But that's really kind of an interesting question. I'm wondering if anybody has ever actually printed a definitive answer as to whether she would had wanted it done as a single volume, because I've never seen that in any of the interview footage. Well, who wants to go next? Richard, you ready? Go ahead.
Yes. Well, let me share my screen. Yeah. What am I? Oh, share. Da, 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 da. All right. Can you see that?
Waiting for it. Yep,
There.
now we're seeing it.
Oh, okay. I want to thank Gianna for coming up with this topic because I was like, oh, I must have something. And when she started speaking, I realized that I have an addendum to the Gone with the Wind story. Um, and just some more statistics. The book was printed in 43 languages in 53 countries. Um, as some of you may know, my wife and I have been doing minor league ballpark tours. So July of 22, I think, we were down in Clybourne, Texas, about 30 miles south of Fort Worth. And if you've ever been to Texas in the summer, it's a little warm. So instead of doing things outdoors, we found this place to go that was air conditioned that we could stay for an hour. And in case you didn't know it, next time you're in Clybourne, Texas, and you want to, and you're a fan of Gone with the Wind, there's an actual Gone with the Wind museum in Clybourne, Texas. Okay. This woman, Vicki Lynn Rogers, was collecting memorabilia and things for 30 years. It is the most comprehensive and extension collection. And I have a couple of pictures. And as you can see, Flato Baldi was with us. He posed for the outside picture there and then also inside. But this woman collected everything to do paintings, dolls, gowns, actual some of the original stuff from the movie. There's part of her doll collection of the different characters throughout the from the movie from around the world. There are movie posters. There are two screening rooms in the museum. You can watch the movie, and there's also interviews of the actors who were, and they talked about their time in the, in making the movie. Um, and like I said, there's a lot of collectors items. Flato Baldi with the dolls. This is some of the toys that came out and the dolls. There's everything from bottle caps and glasses and lunch boxes and purses and just a um, wide collection. Everything from little things to big things to full size things. We were just kind of amazed. My mother-in-law was, obviously a big, not obviously, but a big fan of Gone with the Wind. So that's one of the reasons we went. And like I said, the second reason we went is it was an air-conditioned building you could stay in when the temperature outside was 101. So, oops, we're going to go back. Hold on. Sorry. Um, there. So there's, there's Hattie, and then there's ties, sweaters, vest. I mean, dishes. There's drawers you can open. So it was, a very. I mean, I don't know that there's another collection of Gone with the War, Gone with the Wind items around. Everything to calendars to to books. And like I said, the screening rooms, we sat and listened to some of the actors talk about their experience in making the movie. Um, and then I have an addition to that. Any questions about this? Because I have something else to talk that said we're related. Any questions?
Well, I'd like to add, two things. First of all,
Sure.
many thanks for showing that little bit about Patrick Claiborne,
Well,
Arkansas.
that's coming next. That's
Okay,
the next.
well,
That's the second part of this. We're talking Go with the Wind now. That's coming in one
okay.
second. That's the second part of it.
Well, then, anyone who's going to be traveling in this area, and it's just a few miles from where I'm sitting right now, is the last surviving structure that made an appearance in Gone with the Wind. You see it in the opening credits, a water mill, a grist mill. That's here in North Little Rock, Arkansas. Now, it's not only part of the building was time correct to the mid 1800s. Some of it was Depression era. But the water mill, the old grist mill, is in North Little Rock, Arkansas. It is the one structure that was seen in Gone with the Wind that is still around.
Any other comments or questions?
Kind of amazing.
Okay. Now, as John was alluding to, and I'm about to explain, Clybourne, Texas is also there was a they manufactured railroad cars there, and there's a train museum where they had things are going through town, and then when you go to the history museum in town, um, there's an exhibit on Major General Patrick Clybourne, and for those of you who know the war, um, he he did not survive the war, and also he'd never been to Texas. But apparently, some of the soldiers that fought with and for him loved him so much that when he returned to Texas, they named a town after him. And I was a little stunned to be in Texas and have this exhibit about the Civil War. And there's Flato Baldi, and somewhere I got an oh my God, oh, there's some of the dishes. Oh, there's a Civil War. Why? I'm like, oh, here's all right. Let me just finish. Here's the rest of the museum. Okay, there's a cannon out front, and there's murals. Um, and the Chisholm Trail goes. I'm trying to find. There's actually a bust of Clybourne. In the let me see. Oh, here it is. Okay, I went the wrong way. Here we go. Here's We'll start with this. Here's the train museum, and then they got train layouts, and then here's Patrick Clybourne's gun, and then there's his bust, which I was a little stunned walking into Texas, knowing that he'd not been to Texas, but there he is. And that's the story. He was actually born in Cork, Ireland, and residence in Arkansas. So I guess he was close to, but there it is. There's the thing, close to Texas, but this town is actually named after him in Texas. So this is one of those interesting facts of the Civil War where things like that. But if you're down there, it's a nice little nice town to visit. I don't recommend going there in July, but and if you're into baseball, their team is the Clybourne Railroaders. They play at a place called the Depot, and there's an actual train outside of the
Looks like we lost him. Hopefully we'll get him back, but
So there we go.
Yeah,
Sorry, I must have lost connection. But it's about 30 miles south of Fort Worth, so it's on that side. But I appreciate that Janet came up with that because I got this, this Grow with the Wind Museum. Again, not something I thought about in Texas, but anyway, it's of interest. But thank you
I
for letting
love
me
it.
share. And now you know about the. Oh, Janet wants to say something.
Yeah,
Go
Jan.
ahead.
Well, a little closer to home for us Pasadenans, the barbecue scene at Fair Oaks was actually filmed in Pasadena at the Busch Gardens estate, where it had, rolling hills and lots of gardens, and we can lay claim to that little piece of Gone with the Wind.
Wow, you're kidding. That's amazing.
All right. Oh,
So,
let me stop
so,
sharing.
so Rich, I actually have some news for you. I don't know if you
Okay.
followed the minor league baseball shakeup in California, but the
Sure.
next time you come out here,
What?
there are going to be three of the minor league teams in driving distance of Los Angeles.
Wow.
Because the California League just got all shaken up as far as who plays where, and they're building new
Right.
facilities for a couple of the teams in the area.
Yeah. Somebody told me they're getting a new stadium out there.
Yeah, there are two new stadiums in Southern California, I believe, and the third one's using an older stadium. But
Right.
they're going to be three of the teams in the county just east of Los Angeles.
Do you know what towns they were?
San Bernardino.
No, because it got all changed just very
Okay.
recently. The
Okay.
announcement was just
Yeah.
made. So if you look at the news for the minor leagues, all of
Right.
this stuff
Yeah.
just
Yeah, I
came
saw
out.
they were building one and moving it because when I came out to see you, which might have been it was August of 22, a couple months after this. Um, I went to the Pasadena meeting on a Tuesday night, and then the next day we went to Las Vegas to see the ball team there, and then that Thursday we were in Redlands with Mike Hoover at the Inland Empire 66ers.
Right.
Uh,
Well,
so I
the
got to get,
66ers are going to have two close by neighbors
okay,
starting, I believe, in 25 for one and 26 for the others.
okay, okay.
Huh. That sounds
Yeah,
great.
because in fact, I'm hoping this year to get out to Montana and Idaho to see some teams. But anyway, thank you for letting me share that, and I'll let
Sure.
someone else have a turn.
Michelle, you had your hand up.
Hi. Well, I just have, I don't have any pictures to show. I just have a kind of a short, very Civil War oriented bit of news to share. And that's that last week at the Los Angeles County Board of Supervisors, the Owen Brown grave site was finally totally officially declared an LA County landmark. And that's been a long time coming because we first nominated it in 1989.
Wow.
So that is, and just listening to the interesting discussion so far, it really impresses me about who tells the story, the best story about the war or anything. That's what people remember, no matter its accuracy or anything else. And I just wanted to say that we've also launched a website on Owen Brown that offers some new and interesting evidence that a lot of the narrative of Owen Brown and John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry, that first draft of history was really affected by the fact that John Brown was tried for treason in the Commonwealth of Virginia in kind of a sham trial almost that no reporters from the North were allowed in. And there's a lot more evidence that's coming up now. I guess it's been there all along, but the story of, John Brown, the madman, and of course, that takes on its own reality and the fact that, the first unofficial battle of the Civil War and so forth is going to always be with us. But if you go to Altadena Heritage website and then you just scroll down, there's a whole website within a website on John Brown and Owen Brown, and it offers some I don't want to say exactly conflicting, but some different information about what the purpose of the raid was, and some interviews with Owen Brown and some of the first, archival news that came out about the raid at the time. And so I just would invite people to take a look at that. Also, we have a film that is going to be premiering January 29th called Owen Brown's Body. So
Wow.
that's what I have to share. Thank you. If you have any questions, just ask. But otherwise, that's it.
And I know that Nick and Michelle are going to be too humble to point this out, but they are both featured on a podcast. Uh, what is the series name, Nick?
Hidden
Something about the
Pasadena.
West?
Hidden Pasadena. It's by the Institute on California in the West, but it's or Hidden Histories of Pasadena, something like that.
I think it's Hidden Pasadena.
Hidden
And
Pasadena.
your episode is number 4, I believe.
Number 6.
Number 6, okay. And it's a wonderful podcast episode. If anybody needs the link, I can search that out and get it to you. But it's a wonderful discussion on the Owen Brown gravesite and all that it's been through, and the history. And I have to congratulate Michelle, because you've been there, as you say, from 1989, pushing for this piece of history. And both Michelle and Nick are interviewed on this podcast, so we're happy to have them among us as our hidden celebrities.
Well,
I can say I've only really been involved personally since about 2015. But the organization that I represent, Altadena Heritage, has been on it since 1989. Thanks, Janet.
and if you just for a bit of amusing history, the segment that I did in the interview was actually recorded at the gravesite of Owen's sister, Ruth. And so originally we were worried that the noise of various machinery at the cemetery was too loud for the engineer to clear up. But apparently that was relatively standard stuff.
And
I
one thing
I've
about
got-
the podcast, which I mentioned to Bill, and he's actually written something on the website, is that there was a kind of a not a big mistake, and nothing that a non-historian would make a fuss about. But in it, Bill says that that John Brown was tried in a federal court for treason. In fact, he wasn't. He was tried in the Commonwealth of Virginia. It was a state court in which they completely broke all of the rules about freedom of the press because you weren't allowed in unless you were from a pro-slavery newspaper. And this one fellow, Ned House, snuck in undercover. He was actually one of Horace Greeley's guys, but he was a drama critic, and he was such a good actor. He'd watched so many plays that he convincingly, convinced all the other good old boys that he was one of them, and he snuck his dispatches out. And that was about the only reporter from the trial that wasn't pro-slavery.
I've got a photograph of Owen in front of his house in Pasadena.
Yeah, we've got some wonderful archival photos. If you look out on the website, you'll see some great ones, including Owen and Jason. They were such kind of civil rights guys that when the Chinese Exclusion Act came in, the first thing they did was whoops, my kitty, hire a Chinese guy to work for them.
Wow.
Oh, that was my cat. My cat was on my keyboard. Got it.
Oh, well.
She's messy.
Well, oddly enough, I have something to share with you that connects to some of the things that we've just had discussions of. And this is because I have in my possession a book that I consider the most unusual book published during the lead up to the centennial of the Civil War. Now, I was reading some things about the history of Civil War related movies, and how there were three movies that were considered to be major at the time and with their impact, and those were um, Gone with the Wind, of course, and Glory, of course, and the much more infamous movie of the early days, whose name I shall not mention here. But
Okay.
the thing is, there was another one that had a huge impact on popular culture. It was based on a novel and a play that came out in 1911. And for some reason, the play went to Broadway and lasted there for 2 months. The novel, however, did fairly well. It was one of several successful novels by the author, and it's Edward. I don't know, it's People or Pepple, Peple, and he was writing all kinds of stuff, including humor. And then after his death, I believe, someone in Hollywood said, you know, this would make a really good movie of one of his books, the one that had been the failed play. And sure enough, it turned out to be a hit. It was such a hit that the book ended up getting reprinted multiple times, but it wasn't until 1960 that it came out with a movie edition of a movie that had come out in 1935. So
Wow.
this movie edition had photographs from the film, and the movie and the book were this.
Okay. Okay. Wow. Okay. Yep. Yep.
Now,
Yep.
for
Yep.
those of you who have never read the book or seen the movie,
Saw the movie.
it was about a little girl trying to get her father, who was a Confederate officer, and a Union officer out of the trouble that she'd gotten them into because the two of them had been trying to sneak her from her family's farm, which was south of Petersburg, through the Union and Confederate lines so that she could live with her aunt because her mother had died. And the whole story is not about the standard post-war reconciliation. It's really a Civil War historical story written in such a way that the book was for adults and the movie was for kids, both somewhat educational. And the book was actually more historically accurate because it covered periods of 61 and 64. In the movie, they had to gloss over the fact that Shirley Temple was not getting older during the filming of the movie. So they act as if the whole war started in 64 and continued in 64 because that's the only way they could make it make sense with her not aging. But if you're not familiar with her story and of her co-actors in it, um, one of the slaves on her family's farm was played by Bill Bojangles Robinson. And he was stunned at how good Shirley Temple was as a tap dancer because she was
Really?
only 6 when they were doing the filming.
You're kidding. Wow.
And she was learning his tap dance routines by listening to the sounds his feet made. She would then make her feet make the matching sounds. And if you look at the movie, sometimes she is doing exactly what he's doing, and sometimes she's doing a mirror image of what he's doing because that was how she was interpreting the sounds made by his feet. So sometimes they're both doing right foot, sometimes he's doing right foot, she's doing left foot, an exact mirror image of his dance routines. So it's fascinating to see what she was doing. But the Civil War story told in the novel and in the movie is really interesting because the other change they made for the movie in the book, she and her slave, the Uncle Billy character, go to see General Grant to try and get straightened out whether these two officers should be executed for violations of what they were supposed to do or for espionage or they were accused of an incredible variety of things, considering all they were doing was trying to smuggle a kid through the lines. But in the movie, they bumped it up all the way to them to Shirley Temple's character and Uncle Billy going all the way to Washington, D.C. to talk to President Lincoln to get him to give a pardon. So rather than just having General Grant acquit the two, they went all the way to Washington to do to get a pardon, which is why there's a whole extra dance sequence in the movie because they have to pay for the train ticket to Washington, D.C. from where the Union lines were. I'm not sure there was a train to Washington, D.C. from the lines at Petersburg, but at least not that you could buy a civilian ticket for. But anyway, if you've never seen the movie, it's not what people think it is, but they also have the weirdest idea of what a not very rich family would have had as far as a number of slaves on a relatively small farm. Because they have what seems to be a relatively small farm, and in the book it's made clear that most of the slaves they have ran away when the Union lines were nearby. So it's not a biased thing. It talks about both sides of the story. In the movie, they say, well, most of the slaves ran away, and then 20 of them came out of the building.
In the year after The Little Rebel, the movie version came out, MGM was so hit with how successfully the Shirley Temple film was that they decided they would have their response. And the response was to use the child actors, the Little Rascals, our gang, in a film that went about an hour or so called General Spanky.
You kidding?
And it was set in the Civil War. And the kids were supposed to be in the South, and they were setting up their own sort of military operation to keep the Yankees from coming into the area. That's basically the plot in a nutshell. But it was done obviously as a response. MGM was responding to the success of this Shirley Temple film.
Hmm.
Well, they did one other Shirley Temple Civil War film, but this one I think was the better one. Um, but yeah, General Spanky was a a short film, a short feature-length film, about an hour, 10 minutes. You should be able to find it if you want to see it. It's not great, but the Shirley Temple one is highly amusing if you can find the uncut version. And that's the other tricky bit of legalities. Apparently, because they never had anything in her contracts to permit her films to be converted to other formats with her singing. They had to remove her singing from a couple of the video versions that are out there for the Littlest Rebel, which is very weird. The dancing was apparently okay, but her singing had separate contracts from her acting in the movies.
Hmm.
That had not occurred to me until I found out about the editing. And it's like you can see the movie on YouTube, but it's missing her singing in three of the musical scenes. They had to edit out her singing. They just
Wow.
have her moving her mouth and the sound is blotted out.
I like an interview that I heard of her at one point that she said that she had a tractor that she liked to be able to go out and to be able to actually go and to be able to um, mow the area in front of her house and to be able to just work in the yard and just to get out in nature and things. And she said that people would come by and they would want to take pictures of Shirley Temple's house. And she was out there one day and she was working on the tractor and mowing the yard. And some people came and flagged her down. And she said, I thought they were coming over and asking for an autograph. And so I drove the tractor over and they said, "Can you get out of the way? We're trying to take a picture of Shirley Temple's house." So she accommodated them and
Come
got
on,
out of the
that
way.
was good. That was good. That was good.
Yep. And apparently her earliest dancing appearance in a movie is visible online. She was 3 years old in the first movie in which she did a dance number because she was signed at the age of 3 to do a group of 10-minute short subjects. And one of them is a parody of a Mae West movie. And
Oh
she is
wow.
doing the Mae West part,
You're kidding.
which
At
is as
3.
a saloon dancer.
The
Wow.
baby
Unbelievable.
burlesques.
Yes,
The
that
baby
was
burlesques.
those were little 10-minute bizarre parodies of other stories. And that was she did a little quick buck and wing thing in that movie. But apparently, contrary to what people were being told, she was learning dance stuff all on her own and taught herself how to teach herself, which is just really weird.
Wow.
But that's why she was such a good dancer by the age of 6. She was just learning her own ways of figuring out how to dance.
I'd just
Amazing.
like to add, it's so interesting how this whole myth of the South was so embraced. Like Shirley Temple lived in California, and you know how all of these romantic stories of the South were so popular here. I just came across a map that showed California has more monuments to the Confederacy and schools named after Robert E. Lee and Alabama Hills, more monuments than any state outside of the actual slave states. It's
Amazing.
really interesting to me. And I have to say, it's personally a little distressing how
Well,
popular this myth of the South is.
well, the real problem with that was that a lot of the school names were done during the 1950s.
Hmm.
And it is clear that they were being done in opposition to the civil rights movement. Schools were being named after Confederates. I mean, there were a few that were named that like that early on, like up to World War One, and then it really falls out of favor until after Eisenhower's elected. And that just seemed really creepy to me.
Wow.
It is creepy. And if I can find the map, I can show it of all of the different monuments even in California. Oh, it's, you know what, it's not really going to show, but there's so many of them actually. I mean, besides schools, you know, there's highways that are named after, you know, Robert E. Lee or Stonewall Jackson. Just many instances of celebrating and memorializing Southern and the Southern generals or the Confederacy as something, you know, that is should have, you know, we want to remember, we want to honor, we want to, you know, put up statues. And
Well, following the end of the war, you have a lot of people, both North and South, but arguably you can make the argument it was a little bit more visibly done in the South. You're trying to bring the sections together. There's a historian by the name of Paul Buck who wrote a very, very interesting work called The Road to Reunion. And it goes from 1865 to roughly about 1900. And a big factor, one of several, was the push towards, believe it or not, the fighting with Spain, the Spanish-American War. And in order to get support and in order to get the okay to have some military bases in what had been the Confederacy, you begin to have the great, if you will, reconciliation. And it's done. It is done. The lost cause ethos is going to be developed at this particular time. And you brought something else up. And again, you have to look at the timing. You said after the election of Eisenhower. Well, keep in mind that during the Eisenhower administration, you have a little something goes on, and most famously, it was here again, Central High School, the desegregation of Central High School in 1957. So these are just a couple of the timing. You have to take a look at the timing of when some of these things were going on. And there obviously is a lot more to this, but there were various factors at work. But it was in that generation, one or two generations following the American Civil War, that you were going to see the two sides coming together as they did. That's in a nutshell. It's very, very incomplete, but that was a big factor, a big historical trend that was taking place in post-Civil War, late 19th century America.
Yeah, but in the first 20 years after the war, that push was coming almost entirely from the South.
Mm-hmm.
By the 1890s, yes, there's the push to get the military bases in the South. But by then, you'd already had a lot of other things going on. And that's not really part of the reconciliation movement if you look at where those things were coming from, because those were putting money into the districts in the South. The Southern states were not opposed to money.
And again, something else that the South has been the only section, if you will, in the United States to ever wind up on the losing side of major combat. And like it or not, that's been a factor that has clung to the South really ever since. The author Oscar Wilde was on a lecture tour in America. I believe it was in the 1880s. And one of his comments that he left behind shows that even in the minds of the Southerner, there was, of course, the before and the after, if they're talking about what life was in the South. And he told the story about meeting an older Southern gentleman in the South on this lecture tour, and was remarking about how beautiful everything was. But the old gentleman was talking about how it looked so much, how it was so very different before the Civil War came along, until finally Wilde said, "Well, isn't the moonlight so beautiful?" And the old Southern gentleman basically sighed and said, "Oh, yes, but it was so much more beautiful before the war."
So
Boy.
it's nostalgia for pasts that never were, I think, never quite go out of style. But I would argue that rather than reconciliation, the naming of a lot of these sites and so forth, it's more of this never say die. You think we lost the war, but we didn't, and we're going to come back, and we don't agree with the way the war ended, and don't count us out. That is more how I read it. I mean, but there's many ways you can interpret things that are happening now, or things that happened. Most of the monuments for the Civil War, even in the South, a lot of them were built 30, 40, 50, 60 years after
Right.
In the 1920s, a lot of them
Right.
went. And it was just like,
Mm-hmm.
you think you won the war? Well, think again.
Here in the South, the old joke goes, and I'm probably going to be politically incorrect, but here we go. Ma'am, you have to understand that it wasn't until sometime not all that long ago that here in the South we did not know that damn and Yankee were two separate words.
A little bit off here, somewhat related, but a bit earlier. One of my local hobby rock and gem magazine had an article on origins of names for mining claims in the West, and this covers the whole West, not just California. And they noted a larger number of Confederate names than, say, Union names, claims named after Confederate generals or other Southern references, like, a peach tree or Alabama or whatever. And their thought was that probably a greater number of rebels former rebels, having come home, not much to come home to after in their homes in the South after the war, had gone west seeking to make their fortune as miners, which was why we had so many Confederate named mining claims. I'm just going to throw this out as whatever you want to think about it.
Weirdly enough, that there is a myth that a lot of Southerners came west during the Western period for the being the cowboy and the gunfighter and all that. But yeah, a lot of them came west to be miners. And that was actually something that had started before the war because the Southern California parts where there was mining were heavily Southern just
Right.
because of who came west. So that it wasn't a post-war thing. It was just a continuation of something that had started before the war.
Right.
The northern gold rush stuff wasn't heavily Southern, but the industrial mining in Southern California was heavily Southerners for some reason.
Yeah,
Well,
I mean,
California entered the Union as a free state, but the state of California was very dominated by Southerners, and the chivalry arm of the Democratic
Right.
Party controlled
Yeah.
the state. California, in Congress, California voted with the slave states on almost everything through the 1850s, right up until the Civil War.
I was
So
recently
there was a
reading.
seed planted even well before the war.
I was recently reading a very, very good book about the California Gold Rush and its influence on the coming of the American Civil War, and it bears out what you were just talking about.
Oh, is that Leonard, what's his name's book? Or
Yes.
this book is an incredible book, West of Slavery by Kevin Waite. I don't know if he's ever spoken at the Westerners. He teaches in England, but he's from San Marino. If he ever, we should try to get him to speak, because he comes back regularly.
He spoke on that book when it was first published.
Oh,
It was during the pandemic,
oh yeah.
and so
Oh,
he
I
spoke to
missed
us
it.
virtually. So you can catch his talk on our YouTube channel. But we are trying to get him to come back to talk about Biddy Mason.
Right. He's almost finished his book on Biddy Mason now, I think.
Oh, and Emily pointed out that Southern California almost became its own secession state, but
Right.
that was actually due to California wanting to be two states. The state legislature was trying to make that happen, and it wasn't over anything having to do with secession. They were trying to get the extra congressional representation, the extra senators in Washington.
Hmm.
Well, there's a lot of different ways to interpret, but in 1859, not only did the legislature vote to divide and have the southern part revert to the Colorado Territory, but then we also had a popular vote, and the Californians overall we're all for it. And for a lot of reasons like taxation and representation. California was too big. California had been rushed into statehood without going through all the proper procedures because Washington was very eager that California not like go off on its own and form some, Republic of the Pacific. So for all of those reasons, and so the legislature passed it, popular vote. We had a Lecompton Democrat, Latham, who just signed it to Congress where it was tabled because it was just so close to the Civil War. The last thing they wanted was, a Southern California that if popular sovereignty kicked in, we would have voted to become a slave state, very probably.
Right. Right.
That's tougher because the conditions were not there for the kind of industry that a slave state needed to support.
Well, that was the argument, but we already had slavery here with the bondage of Indians, and it was not just about slavery. The South was very keen to have a pathway to the sea for trade.
Oh, yes.
So, I mean, there are
And
many
gold,
factors,
gold.
many factors that were all, in play at the time.
And people say gold, but most of the gold was in Northern California.
Right.
Right.
There was actually just in a little bit of gold here, a little bit of other stuff. A lot of industrial mining was with Southern California.
But it was shipped
Weirdly
down to
enough,
the south.
low quality gemstones were the other thing that was in Southern California. Well, we've been going for quite a while. Do we have any other people who want to do a presentation, or shall we call it?
Actually, I do.
Oh,
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 good.
yay.
Yeah. So, as many of you know, that and you can see the Civil War image that I restored and colorized over behind me here, that I collect Civil War images, and that this summer, Stephanie and I attended the annual 3D convention. They are in various places around the country. This time they happened to be in Kansas. And when we were there, I picked up a Civil War stereo card among others. So I did collect some other ones in there for that were ones of non-Civil War type of images, but I picked up one. So I thought I would share a little bit about that. Let me go ahead and share my screen so I can talk a little bit about what we have here. So if you take a look at this, you'll see on there for that that this is the stereo card that I picked up. I just did a close-up of it to be able to see it. Basically, it's of a Fort Sumter, and that you can see, which is kind of interesting here, is that you can actually see the photographer here in the image, and so they're actually showing up. But what I did was I went over to the Library of Congress, and I actually found this picture on the Library of Congress, and you can actually see it here and here, the left and right sides, and you can actually see more detail when you're looking at the detail of the photo over here to be able to see it. According to the Library of Congress, this is Samuel Cooley. However, according to the stereo card that I have here, it actually says that it was done by John, I'm not sure, Goule or Boule. I'm not sure exactly what that is.
I think
But
SOU something E.
maybe, yeah. But
S-O-U, Soule. It would be pronounced Soule.
okay.
Yeah.
However, the Library of
Will
Congress
Sewell.
lists it uh, as being Sam Cooley. So I'm not sure what the difference is there and why they're showing something different. Basically, this is a digital stereo reproduction that I did a couple of years ago of the card. So the card that I have here has been reproduced digitally in there for that. I didn't repair any of the damage in there for that. And you can see damage in the original just from age for this particular one. But anyway, I always enjoy finding those, and again, this is one that I have actually done some work on and have some connection with for there. Stephanie and I have actually been to these locations at Fort Sumter as well, so just wanted to be able to share that.
Well, the photographer was Will Sewell, who photographed American Indians in the West in the 1850s, 1860s. I have some photographs of his.
Okay.
David, is there anything in the Library of Congress that is the corresponding picture that the photographer was shooting the other direction?
No, well, actually, I can't say because that it's oftentimes difficult to be able to be able to see that in there for that. So I don't have that. Here's actually what I'll do is I'll post this into the chat if anybody's interested in actually taking a look at what the Library of Congress has to be able to say about it. You can find it on the link that I just posted there if you want to be able to take a look at that.
And this has been great. This is much better than I ever expected it to be. This is great.
I hate to
See,
keep
you've been missing out all this time.
I hate to keep
This has been
breaking
great.
in, but I'd like to ask someone who's online a question, and I hope he will unmute if I say the word crikey.
G'day, my good friend Jan.
Yeah, how you doing? Barry, how about sharing with all of us two things? Have there been any new discoveries, photographs, letters, anything about the CSS Shenandoah and its visit to Melbourne? And secondly, do you have any updates about the veterans, the Civil War veterans who are buried down under?
Talking about the Civil War veterans who are buried here, there's four of them who are buried at my local cemetery about 3 or 4 miles from my place. And the United States Consul, the United States veterans, the American Civil War Roundtable of Australia are hoping to do a Memorial Day service around about May next year. Locally, we've been having a service with the Melbourne Shrine of Remembrance and the US Consulate that I've been invited to for the last 40 years. And we've been able to do that successfully, but there might be hopefully plans that we're going to do something locally rather than in the centre of downtown Melbourne. As regards to Civil War veterans, not a lot of recent news and information. We seem to have reached about the bottom of the barrel with any new hopeful finds. About 90% of the Civil War veterans that we've located so far are Union Army or Union Navy, and only about 10% from the Confederate states. And we think that's possibly either due to lack of information about where the veterans went to in the South after the war, or lack of money to go anywhere. So as far as we can tell, much easier to apply for a pension to the US government and get the money sent to Australia. Thank you, Jan.
And Nick,
Mhm.
I just, based on what you said before, I just looked into what you said. It's actually the city of Ontario that's building a new stadium,
Yes,
and the Dodgers single A team, which I guess is currently in Rancho Cucamonga, the Quakes, are moving to Ontario in 2026.
right.
So,
Yeah, that's the one where there was the article in the Los Angeles Times about, because it's a Dodgers minor league team. But
right,
they were
right.
saying that there was another one that was moving around to a
Yeah,
better
but
facility.
this one, yeah, this one is happening now. I guess they're building it now for next year. So, okay, cool.
Yes. So now you have another goal in mind.
Well, I gotta get out there because I've been to the Lincoln Shrine, but there's the other what's the other thing with the Labor Day thing? Yes, the Labor Day event. Janet, help me out here.
Oh yeah, the Huntington Beach thing.
The beach, yeah. So, and I haven't gotten to the hunting museum because that's closed on Tuesdays, which is the day I was there. So we'll
Yep.
be back in a year or so. Thanks.
All right. Well, do we have any other presenters for this evening? This has been a really productive event this time. I'm glad so many of you were able to bring things to share. All right. Well, if we
Thank you.
have nothing else, then I would say good night and hope to see many of you again at our regular meetings. And for those of you too far away for those, hope to see you next year.
Happy
Thanks,
holidays.
everybody.
Happy New Year.
Happy
Travel safe.
holidays.
Thanks.
Right.
Thanks.
Thank you so
Thank
much,
you.
David, for helping us do this.
Absolutely,
Thank you,
Nick.
David.
Yeah. Hopefully I'll be
Thank
able
you,
to do it in
David.
person with you again soon, but if not, we'll be here again next year.
All right.
We appreciate that, David. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody.